So what's the deal with Pope Francis? He's forgiving on divorce, welcoming Muslim refugees, adamant on global warming, soft on gays, hard on unfettered capitalism. Where does he get these ideas? Remember those words? They were in an editorial cartoon in our newspaper just a few weeks ago when the Pope was here. If you saw the cartoon, you know that the Pope was giving out communion, and there were three worshipers kneeling at the communion rail. And one gentleman was looking at the woman next to him saying those exact words. And do you remember her answer to his question? She looks at him and says, "Let me give a wild guess. I think it's Jesus." Well, many people believe that the Pope has wild ideas. But what about the answer that Jesus gives to the young man in our gospel this evening, who asks what he must do to gain eternal life? It was certainly shocking then. I would believe it'd be more shocking now if Jesus stood in Congress and gave that same answer. Go and sell what you have, give to the poor, you will have treasure in heaven, then come follow me. In the gospel, the young man's face fell. I believe all of our faces would fall too. Jesus was always using shocking words to move people out of their complacency, to move people out of their slumber. Jesus always challenged any system that did not care for the common good and care for the poorest of the poor. So this weekend, in a shocking way, Jesus challenges all of our greed. The great pollster Zogby recently conducted a large benchmark poll in which respondents identified greed and materialism as the number one most urgent problem in American culture. Poverty and economic justice finished in second place. In 2014, a Vanity Fair poll, 78% of Americans disagreed with the famous Gordon Gekko quote, "Greed is good." Only 19% agreed. A recent poll of Economist readers asked, "What is the deadliest sin?" And greed ranked number one. But surprisingly, although everyone thinks that greed is a terrible problem, most people don't think they are greedy. When the BBC conducted a poll on the seven deadly sins, which are anger and envy and gluttony, greed, lust, pride, and sloth, greed came in last on the list in answer to two questions. The first, which sin have you ever committed? And the second, which sin have you committed in the past month? Plenty of the Brits copped to being lazy and proud and envious and angry, but greedy? It was 7th out of 7, last on the list. Tim Keller argues, even though it's clear that the world is filled with greed and materialism, almost no one thinks it is true of them. Greed hides itself from the victim. This weekend, Jesus uses shocking words to wake us up. He doesn't expect that we're going to give away all that we have and live on nothing. He uses shocking literary words. But the challenge is to use what we have wisely, to not be possessed by our possessions, to share with those who are definitely in need, the poorest of the poor, and to not gain our wealth by hurting other people or using other people. So this weekend, each one of us is challenged to acknowledge our own temptations to be greedy. One of the best examples that I've seen lately of the destructiveness of greed is that recent movie, The Wolf of Wall Street. It demonstrated the real-life pump and dump stock fraud scheme where the insiders take advantage of unwitting investors. They get them to buy penny stocks, drive up the prices, sell their holdings, the insiders win, the investors lose, and they lose big. It seems that for some people, no matter how much money and things they have, it's never, ever enough. Historian Daniel Burstyn suggests that Americans suffer from all too extravagant expectations. In his often quoted book, The Image, he makes this observation of Americans. He says, "We expect everything and anything. We expect the contradictory and the impossible. We expect compact cars which are spacious, luxurious cars which are economical. We expect to be rich and charitable, powerful and merciful, active and reflective, kind and competitive. We expect to eat and stay thin, to be constantly on the move and ever more neighborly, to go to a church of our choice and yet feel its guiding power over us, to revere God and to be God, and never have people been more masters of the environment, yet never has the people felt more deceived and disappointed. For never has the people expected so much more than the world could offer." We do live in a world of excess. And we all, each one of us, has to admit that we are tempted all the time to have more and more. And when Pope Francis criticizes the excesses of our world, he really isn't making an economic statement, but what he is doing is he is putting forth applications of the gospel and moral theology. When the Pope writes about a lifestyle that excludes others, he's talking about the corporate and financial high flyers where their only God is profit. And when the Pope warns how easily people slip into narcissistic indifference, he talks about everybody, including himself. He wrote, "It's the human condition that we must constantly fight in our own lives. Too often greed can make us incapable of feeling compassion at the outcry of the poor, weeping for others' pain, feeling a need to help them, as though all this were someone else's responsibility and not our own." Greed is the unscrupulous desire for wealth and power. Unscrupulous. It can damage us individually. It can damage marriage relationships. It can damage families. It can damage our community and our nation. I remember an article I read a couple of years ago about a couple who were married for 81 years, John and Ann Batar. It was back in November 25th, 1932, that they said, "I do." Since then, they weathered many storms. But after 81 years together, they still got up every morning and greeted each other with eagerness and gratitude. But they lived through the Great Depression, World War II, they lived through Vietnam, they lived through the terrorist attacks of 9/11 and two powerful hurricanes. It was November of 2012 that I read the article, and John was 101 and Ann was 98. And they were still living in their own home. They had 5 children, 14 grandchildren, 16 great-grandchildren. Ann wrote about they eloped because she said, "We didn't have any money to go any farther." And all of their friends and family said, "You will never make it. It will never last." 2 years ago, they were still happily married. And they each offered some simple guidelines for building a lasting marriage. John said, "Get along, compromise, live within your means, and be content." And then he added, "Let your wife be the boss." But Ann countered that statement and she said, "We don't have bosses." But John re-emphasized and said, he talked about the importance of living with contentment. He said, "We just live with contentment and we don't live beyond our means." See, that's the answer to greed. Contentment is the answer to greed, to the temptations that we all have to give in to greed, of never having enough. How did they stay married for 81 years? Well, they didn't expect from the world or from marriage more than it could give them. They were content. They didn't expect the contradictory and the impossible. They weren't deceived or disappointed. They knew each other's limitations and the limitations of life, and they were simply grateful for what they had. Because of this, they lasted at least 81 years. Greed can be destructive. 2,000 years ago, Jesus said the same thing and shocked those people. He shocks us today. What he is saying and what Francis is saying is, stop expecting what the world can't give us, the contradictory and the impossible. Then we won't feel deceived and disappointed. Live within our means. Get beyond, every day struggle to get beyond our narcissistic indifference. And take care of each other. Take care of each other is what Jesus said, what Francis says. So what's the deal with Francis? Let me take a guess. He's simply struggling to live out the message of Jesus. And he admits he's not doing it perfectly. But that's all he asks of us. Struggle to live out the message, even if we don't live it perfectly.